It's 2:47 a.m. You're alone in your room, listening to this story, probably thinking cemeteries are just quiet places where the dead rest peacefully. But what if I told you that some of the most terrifying encounters don't come from the graves themselves, but from the living who tend to them? Tonight, I'm sharing 5 bone-chilling accounts from cemetery chaplains, the holy men and women who've dedicated their lives to comforting the grieving and blessing the departed. These aren't urban legends or folklore. These are real testimonies from people whose faith was tested by encounters so horrifying, some abandoned their calling entirely. Fair warning, if you're already tucked into bed, you might want to check that your doors are locked, because after tonight, you'll never look at a cemetery the same way again. Let's begin with our first chapter. Chapter 1. Father Marcus Holloway had been the chaplain at Evergreen Memorial Cemetery in rural Vermont for 17 years. If you've ever driven through small-town New England, you know the type of place I'm talking about: rolling hills dotted with centuries-old headstones, ancient oak trees whose gnarled branches seem to reach toward heaven like desperate fingers, and that perpetual mist that clings to the ground even on the clearest days. Marcus wasn't your typical man of the cloth. At 6'3" with hands scarred from years of manual labor before finding his calling, he'd seen his share of life's harsh realities. Vietnam veteran, former construction worker, divorced father of 2, he came to ministry later in life, carrying wounds that only faith could heal. The locals respected him not just for his collar, but for his authenticity. When Marcus spoke about suffering, people listened because they knew he'd walked through his own valley of shadows. You know, most people think cemetery chaplains just show up for funerals and go home. But Marcus lived on the grounds in a small rectory built in 1847, its windows overlooking the older section where headstones bore dates from the Revolutionary War. He'd chosen this isolation deliberately. No neighbors to worry about, no city noise to disturb his prayers, just him and the eternal residents of Evergreen Memorial. It started on a Tuesday night in October 2019. Marcus was completing his evening rounds, something he'd done religiously for over a decade. These weren't official duties. They were personal rituals. He'd walk the perimeter, checking for vandalism, ensuring the gates were secure, and offering quiet prayers over fresh graves where families might still be struggling with loss. The temperature had dropped unexpectedly that evening. One moment it was a comfortable 55 degrees. The next his breath was forming clouds in the suddenly frigid air. Marcus pulled his jacket tighter and quickened his pace toward the northeast corner where the oldest graves lay. That's when he heard it, crying. Not the gentle weeping you might expect from a mourner visiting a loved one's grave, but raw, desperate sobbing that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Marcus stopped walking, his veteran instincts immediately alert. In 17 years, he'd encountered his share of midnight visitors, grieving family members who couldn't sleep, teenagers looking for thrills, even the occasional person contemplating joining the cemetery's permanent residence. He knew how to handle living people. But this sound, there was something fundamentally wrong with it. Following the source, Marcus made his way deeper into the old section. The sobbing grew louder, more desperate, punctuated by what sounded like scratching fingernails dragging across stone. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating weathered headstones and bare earth between the graves. And then he saw her. She was kneeling beside a grave dated 1923. Her white dress pristine despite being pressed against the damp ground. Her long, dark hair fell forward, obscuring her face as she clawed at the headstone with her bare hands. Blood streaked down the marble surface where her fingernails had torn away. "Ma'am," Marcus called out gently, his chaplain training overriding his growing unease. "Are you all right?" The sobbing stopped instantly. The silence that followed was worse than the crying. It was the kind of absolute quiet that makes your ears ring and your skin crawl. Even the October wind had died down, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Slowly, impossibly slowly, the woman's head began to turn toward him. Marcus had counseled grieving families for nearly 2 decades. He'd held dying hands in hospital rooms, comforted parents who'd lost children, spoken at funerals where the congregation was too broken to sing hymns. He thought he understood the depths of human sorrow. He was wrong. When the woman's face came into view, Marcus saw anguish so profound it seemed to bend reality around it. Her eyes, if you could call them eyes, were hollow voids that seemed to pull light into them. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, stretched wider than any human jaw should allow. But worst of all was her skin. It was translucent, revealing dark veins underneath like cracks in ancient porcelain. "Help me," she whispered, though her mouth didn't move. The voice came from everywhere: the ground, the air, inside Marcus's own head. Marcus did what any rational person would do. He ran. His military training, his years of counseling, his faith, none of it prepared him for what he'd just witnessed. He sprinted back toward the rectory, his flashlight beam dancing wildly ahead of him, illuminating headstones that suddenly seemed to lean inward like spectators watching a race. Behind him, the sobbing resumed, but now it was moving, following. Marcus risked a glance over his shoulder and immediately wished he hadn't. The woman was pursuing him, but not running. She was gliding above the ground, her white dress billowing around her like smoke, her arms outstretched as if trying to embrace him from 30 yards away. He reached the rectory and fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking so badly he dropped them twice. The sobbing was getting closer, mixing with what sounded like whispers in a language he didn't recognize. Finally, the key turned, and he threw himself inside, slamming the door and turning every lock. Marcus pressed his back against the door and slid to the floor, gasping. Through the window, he could see her standing just outside the circle of light from his porch lamp. Waiting, she stood there until dawn. Most people would have called in sick the next day, maybe started looking for a transfer to a nice suburban parish with well-lit parking lots and security cameras. But Marcus had faced down Viet Cong snipers and survived a marriage that nearly broke him. He wasn't about to be driven away by whatever this was. The next morning, he drove to the county clerk's office and began researching the grave where he'd found the woman. The headstone belonged to Eleanor Whitmore, died October 15, 1923, age 28. The death certificate listed cause of death as complications from childbirth, but a few hours of digging revealed a darker truth. Eleanor had died giving birth to her fourth child in the basement of her home. The local doctor, overwhelmed by a flu epidemic, hadn't been available. Her husband, desperate to save her, had attempted to deliver the child himself. Both mother and baby died in agony. But here's where it gets interesting, and by interesting, I mean absolutely terrifying. According to police reports Marcus found buried in old archives, Eleanor's husband claimed she'd been speaking to someone in the weeks before her death, someone who visited her at night when he was asleep, someone who promised to help her with the difficult birth, someone who wore a white dress and had no face. Marcus spent the rest of that day reading every scrap of information he could find about Evergreen Memorial Cemetery. What he discovered made his blood run cold. Eleanor wasn't the first. Every 20 to 30 years, dating back to the cemetery's founding in 1798, there were reports of a woman in white appearing to pregnant women in the town. The encounters always followed the same pattern. The woman would appear to expectant mothers experiencing difficult pregnancies, promising help and comfort. Within weeks, both mother and child would die in childbirth under mysterious circumstances. And then, for the next 20 to 30 years, people would report seeing a woman in white wandering the cemetery, sobbing and clawing at headstones, as if searching for something. Marcus realized with growing horror that it was 2019, exactly 26 years since the last reported death matching this pattern. She was hunting again. That night, despite every instinct telling him to stay inside, Marcus returned to Eleanor's grave. He carried his flashlight, his Bible, and something he hadn't touched since Vietnam, a .45 caliber pistol. He wasn't sure bullets would stop whatever this thing was, but the weight of the weapon provided psychological comfort. The woman was already there, kneeling in the same position as the night before. But this time, she wasn't alone. Surrounding Eleanor's grave were 6 other figures, all women in various states of decay, all wearing white burial dresses, all clawing at their own headstones with bloodied fingers. Marcus recognized some of the names from his research: Margaret Thorne, 1847, Sarah Blackwood, 1871, Emma Hartwell, 1896, Generations of women who died the same way, bound together by something that refused to let them rest. When they sensed Marcus's presence, all 7 heads turned toward him in perfect unison. 7 mouths opened in silent screams. 7 pairs of hollow eyes fixed on him with desperate hunger. "Help us," they whispered as one. "Help us find her." "Find who?" Marcus asked, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. The woman in the center, the one he now knew was Eleanor, raised a translucent hand and pointed deeper into the cemetery, toward the newer section where recent burials were located. And Marcus understood. There was another pregnant woman in town, another difficult pregnancy, another potential victim. The entities weren't just wandering aimlessly. They were trying to warn him. They were trying to prevent another woman from joining their eternal sorority of suffering. But as Marcus would soon learn, some warnings come too late, and some evil is too patient to be stopped by good intentions. The 7 women began to move toward the new section of the cemetery, and Marcus found himself following, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't explain. He was about to discover that his encounter with Eleanor was just the beginning, and that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. But that revelation would have to wait, because what Marcus saw in the new section of the cemetery would challenge everything he thought he knew about death, faith, and the terrible persistence of evil. And you're going to hear about it in our next chapter. Following the 7 spirits through Evergreen Memorial Cemetery at 3 a.m. was not something Marcus had ever imagined doing when he'd taken his vows. The procession moved with purpose, not the aimless wandering of lost souls, but the determined march of beings with a mission. Their white burial gowns fluttered in a wind that Marcus couldn't feel, and their bare feet left no impressions in the damp earth. They led him to Section K, the newest addition to the cemetery, opened just 5 years ago when the original grounds had finally reached capacity. Here, the headstones were still sharp-edged, the engravings crisp, and the graves covered with flowers that families still remembered to bring. The procession stopped at a freshly filled grave with a temporary marker. Marcus read the name, Jennifer Walsh, 1991 to 2019, beloved wife and mother. The date of death was just 4 days ago. Now, you might be thinking, what's so scary about a recent burial? Trust me, I had the same question when I first heard this story. Recent deaths are sad, certainly, but they're part of the natural cycle. It's the old graves that are supposed to be haunting, right? Marcus was about to learn that some evils don't need time to ripen. Sometimes the most dangerous spirits are the freshest ones. Eleanor and the other spirits arranged themselves in a circle around Jennifer's grave, their hollow eyes fixed on the freshly turned earth. Then, in a voice that seemed to come from the ground itself, Eleanor spoke. She was pregnant. Marcus felt his stomach drop. The obituary didn't mention. 3 months, whispered Margaret Thorne, the woman who died in 1847. She didn't know yet. The car accident, added Sarah Blackwood. It wasn't an accident. Marcus pulled out his phone and, hands shaking, searched for Jennifer Walsh's obituary online. The article was brief. Jennifer Walsh, 28, died tragically in a single-car accident on Route 9 Tuesday evening. She leaves behind her husband David and 2 young children, Emma and Michael. Services were held Friday at Evergreen Memorial Cemetery. But something was wrong with the story. Marcus had been to hundreds of funerals, had comforted countless grieving families. He knew the signs of a family destroyed by sudden tragedy, and David Walsh hadn't shown them. He'd been calm during the service, almost relieved, and he'd insisted on a closed casket, unusual for someone who died in what should have been a simple car accident. What really happened to her? Marcus asked the spirits. Eleanor's form began to solidify, becoming more corporeal as her anguish intensified. He found out about the pregnancy, about the other man. The pieces clicked together in Marcus's mind with horrible clarity. Jennifer Walsh had been having an affair. Her husband discovered she was pregnant and, not knowing if the child was his, had murder, Emma Hartwell confirmed, as if reading his thoughts. Same as all of us. Men who couldn't bear the thought of sharing us, even with death. What Marcus learned next would haunt him for the rest of his abbreviated career as a cemetery chaplain. The spirits didn't just gather around Jennifer's grave to mourn another victim. They were there to recruit her. "She's fighting it," Eleanor explained. "Fighting the call. She doesn't understand what happened to her yet." "But she will," added Margaret. "They always do eventually. And when she accepts the truth, she'll join us." "Join you in what?" Marcus demanded. "In hunting," Sarah whispered. "In finding the others who will die as we died. In trying to save them, even though we always fail." The horrible logic of it began to make sense. Every 20 to 30 years, the spirits would manifest to warn the living about pregnant women in danger. But their warnings were never specific enough, never timely enough. They could sense the patterns, the domestic violence, the affairs, the desperation, but they couldn't prevent the murders. They could only add the victims to their number and begin the cycle again. "How many are there?" Marcus asked. "How many women have died this way?" The spirits exchanged glances. Eleanor spoke for them all. "In this cemetery? 43. Across the world." She paused, her hollow eyes reflecting depths of sorrow that no living person should ever witness. "Thousands, millions, perhaps. Every woman who died by violence while carrying life. We're all connected, all part of the same endless sorrow." That's when the ground above Jennifer Walsh's grave began to tremble. Marcus stumbled backward as the earth cracked and shifted. The temporary grave marker tilted and fell. And from beneath the surface came a sound that would plague his nightmares for years to come. The sound of fingernails scratching against wood. "She's waking up," Eleanor said with something that might have been satisfaction in a living person but was pure anguish in the dead. "She's starting to remember." The scratching grew more frantic. Then came the screaming muffled by 6 feet of earth and a coffin lid, but unmistakably human, unmistakably terrified. "We have to help her," Marcus said, starting toward the grave. "No." Eleanor's voice was suddenly sharp, commanding. "She has to come to the truth herself. We all did. You're going to let her suffer down there?" "She's been suffering down there for 4 days," Margaret replied. "The same way we all suffered. The same way every murdered woman suffers. Aware, trapped, helpless." The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. Jennifer Walsh hadn't died in the car accident. She'd been severely injured, possibly paralyzed, but alive when her husband had buried her. The funeral service, the closed casket, the quick burial, it had all been an elaborate cover-up for a living burial. And now, for days later, she was finally dying of dehydration and suffocation, awakening to her true nature as one of the vengeful dead. The scratching and screaming continued for another 20 minutes before gradually fading to silence. Marcus watched in horror as the 7 spirits welcomed their newest member, a figure in a blood-stained wedding dress emerging from the disturbed earth like a flower blooming in reverse. Jennifer Walsh's spirit was different from the others. Where they showed decay and translucence, she burned with fresh rage. Her eyes weren't hollow voids but blazing coals of fury. When she spoke, her voice carried the raw edge of someone who discovered betrayal in their final moments. "David," she hissed. "Where is David?" "Patience," Eleanor counseled. "First, we must teach you the way of things." But Jennifer wasn't interested in patience. She was interested in revenge. That's when headlights swept across the cemetery. A car was pulling up to the main gate, a sedan that Marcus recognized as belonging to David Walsh. The widower was returning to the scene, possibly to check on his wife's grave, possibly to satisfy some twisted psychological need to revisit his crime. He was about to get more than he bargained for. David Walsh parked his car and walked slowly towards Section K, carrying a small bouquet of flowers. He looked exactly like what he was, a man putting on a performance of grief for an audience of no one. His clothes were freshly pressed, his hair neatly combed, his expression practiced in its sorrow. He never saw the 8 spirits standing between the headstones, watching his approach with expressions ranging from pity to rage. But he felt them. David's step faltered about 50 yards from Jennifer's grave. The temperature had dropped again. That sudden, unnatural cold that precedes supernatural encounters. His breath began to mist, and he pulled his jacket tighter around himself. "Jennifer?" he called out tentatively. "Jen, is that you?" You have to appreciate the irony here. This man had buried his wife alive, and now he was calling out to her like he expected a friendly ghost to appear and absolve him of his sins. He was half right about the ghost part. Jennifer materialized directly in front of him, her spirit form so solid that David stumbled backward in shock. She was beautiful and terrible, still recognizably the woman he'd married, but transformed by death and fury into something that belonged in humanity's oldest nightmares. "Hello, David," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to come from the earth itself. "Miss me?" David's carefully maintained composure cracked like ice in spring. You're supposed to be dead." Jennifer laughed, and the sound made every dog within a mile radius start howling. "Oh, I am dead, darling. Thanks to you. But death isn't the end you thought it would be." She began to advance on him, and with each step, her appearance shifted. The beautiful young woman David had murdered flickered in and out of focus, replaced by glimpses of what she'd become during her 4-day living burial, emaciated, dehydrated, her fingernails bloody from clawing at her coffin lid. "I remember everything," she continued. "The car accident you staged, waking up paralyzed in the backseat while you drove me to the funeral home, lying helpless while you paid off the mortician to skip the embalming, being conscious when they lowered my coffin into the ground." David was backing away steadily, but for every step he took, Jennifer matched it. Behind her, the 7 other spirits formed a circle, cutting off his escape routes. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," David stammered. "I was angry about the pregnancy, about the affair, but I never meant to bury me alive." Jennifer's eyes flared brighter. "What did you mean to do, David? Kill me quickly? How considerate." What happened next was unlike anything Marcus had ever witnessed, and he'd thought he'd seen every variation of human evil during his time in Vietnam and his years counseling the bereaved. The 8 spirits arranged themselves in a formal circle around David Walsh, with Jennifer at the center as both prosecutor and judge. But this wasn't going to be a quick supernatural execution. This was going to be a trial. "David Walsh," Eleanor intoned, her voice taking on the formality of a court proceeding. "You stand accused of the murder of your wife and unborn child. How do you answer?" "This isn't real," David whispered. "This is a nightmare. Jen is dead. She's buried right there." He pointed at the disturbed grave with a shaking hand. "Indeed I am," Jennifer agreed. "But death has given me perspective, and a jury of my peers." Each of the other spirits stepped forward in turn, recounting their own murders with clinical detachment. Margaret, poisoned by her husband when he discovered her pregnancy wasn't his. Sarah, pushed down the stairs by her lover when she threatened to tell his wife. Emma, strangled by her father when he learned of her condition. 7 testimonies of domestic violence spanning nearly 2 centuries, all culminating in the same pattern: pregnancy discovered, woman killed, crime covered up, spirit bound to the cemetery to witness and warn. "We've all tried to prevent more deaths," Eleanor explained to David. "We appear to pregnant women in town, trying to warn them of danger. Sometimes they listen and leave abusive situations. Sometimes they don't. But we keep trying because it's the only purpose left to us. Until now," Jennifer added, her rage building like a storm front. "I'm tired of just warning people. I think it's time we started punishing the guilty." David tried to run then, finally understanding that this was no fever dream or psychological breakdown. But the spirits had him surrounded, and as he discovered, the dead can move faster than the living when they choose to. Jennifer caught him before he'd taken 3 steps, her incorporeal hand somehow solid enough to grip his throat and lift him off the ground. David's feet kicked uselessly in the air as his wife's spirit held him suspended above the cemetery grass. "You want to know what it felt like?" she whispered. "Lying in that coffin, running out of air, clawing until my fingernails tore away? Let me show you." The ground beneath David's feet began to open like a mouth, revealing a rectangular pit exactly the dimensions of a grave. The sides were perfectly smooth, as if carved by invisible tools, and the bottom was lined with what looked like splinters of wood coffin fragments. "Jennifer, please," David gasped. "I'm sorry. I was crazy with jealousy. I loved you." "Love?" Jennifer's grip tightened. "You buried me alive, David. Love doesn't do that." But Marcus couldn't let this happen. Despite everything he'd learned, despite the justice of it, he was still a chaplain, still a man of God, still someone who believed in forgiveness over revenge. "Jennifer," he called out, "this won't bring you peace." She turned to look at him, and for a moment her expression softened. "Father Holloway, I wondered when you'd speak up." "I've seen what revenge does to people," Marcus continued. "It doesn't heal the wound, it just spreads the poison." "And what would you have me do? Forgive him? Turn the other cheek?" "I'd have you find peace, real peace, not this eternal cycle of warning and watching." Jennifer was quiet for a long moment, David still suspended in her grip above the open grave. The other spirits watched intently, and Marcus realized this moment would determine not just David Walsh's fate, but the nature of Jennifer's afterlife. Finally, she spoke. "Peace is for the innocent, Father. We are something else now." And with that, she released her grip. David plummeted into the grave, and the earth immediately began to close over him. His screams were cut off as the soil reached his throat, then his mouth, then finally covered him completely. Within minutes, the ground was smooth again, as if nothing had happened. But something had changed. Marcus could feel it in the air, in the sudden stillness of the night, in the way the other spirits looked at Jennifer with something approaching awe. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. Jennifer smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression he'd ever seen, beautiful and damned in equal measure. "Now we stop just warning people," she said. "Now we start collecting the guilty." Marcus realized he'd just witnessed the birth of something new and terrible. A spirit driven not by sorrow but by righteous fury, not content to warn the living but determined to punish the guilty. And as he would learn in the days to come, Jennifer Walsh's transformation would attract others of her kind from cemeteries across the region. The hunting season had just begun. But that's a story for our next chapter, where Marcus would discover that some evils grow stronger when they work together. 3 days after David Walsh disappeared into an unmarked grave, Marcus Holloway received his first taste of how quickly word spreads in the supernatural community. He was in his rectory at dawn, trying to make sense of his notes about the previous night's encounters, when he felt the temperature drop so suddenly that frost formed on his coffee mug. They were coming. Not just Jennifer and the original 7 spirits of Evergreen Memorial Cemetery, but others. Marcus could sense them approaching from multiple directions, a convergence of the vengeful dead that stretched his understanding of how the spiritual realm operated. Through his window, he watched figures emerging from the tree line. Women in burial clothes from different eras, different centuries even. Some wore the simple white gowns favored by 19th century mourners, others the elaborate funeral dresses of the Victorian era. A few were clad in more modern attire, the business suits and casual clothes they died in when burial customs changed. But they all shared the same aura of righteous fury that now surrounded Jennifer Walsh. When most people think about ghost stories, they imagine one spirit haunting one location. Maybe a vengeful ghost seeking justice for a single wrong. But what Marcus was witnessing was something unprecedented, a supernatural networking event, and the guest list was terrifying. They gathered in the oldest section of the cemetery, where the Revolutionary War graves provided a natural amphitheater among the ancient oaks. Marcus counted them as they assembled. 43 spirits, just as Eleanor had predicted. But these weren't just the murdered women of Evergreen Memorial. Jennifer had somehow called to others of her kind across the region. There was Catherine Morrison from Pine Hill Cemetery in Massachusetts, strangled by her husband in 1976 when he discovered her affair. Maria Santos from Holy Cross in Connecticut, beaten to death by her boyfriend in 1993 when she refused to have an abortion. Rebecca Thompson from Mountain View in New Hampshire, shot by her father in 1889 when her pregnancy brought shame to the family. Each carried the same burning rage, the same demand for justice that had transformed Jennifer from a traditional warning spirit into something far more dangerous. Marcus watched from a distance as Jennifer took her place at the center of the gathering. Where the other spirits showed various stages of decay and translucence, she remained solid, corporeal, radiating power like a dark star drawing satellites into her orbit. Sisters, Jennifer's voice carried clearly across the cemetery grounds. We've spent decades, centuries, warning the living about dangers they refused to hear. We've watched our killers live full lives while we remained bound to graves and regret. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembled spirits. But no more, Jennifer continued. I've shown you what happens when we stop asking for justice and start taking it. David Walsh will never hurt another woman. What do you propose? Asked Catherine Morrison, her 1970s burial dress fluttering in the supernatural wind that seemed to follow these gatherings. A new covenant, Jennifer replied. We share information. We coordinate efforts. When one of us identifies a threat, an abuser, a potential killer, we act together. No more solitary warnings that go unheeded. No more watching helplessly while history repeats. Maria Santos stepped forward, her modern burial attire marking her as one of the more recent additions to this supernatural sisterhood. I've been monitoring my old neighborhood in Hartford, she said. There's a situation developing. Marcus found himself leaning closer, drawn despite his horror by the clinical efficiency with which these spirits discussed their vigilante activities. Tell us, Jennifer commanded. Robert Chun, 34, insurance adjuster, married to Lisa Chen, 29, currently 6 months pregnant with their first child. Robert's been increasingly controlling since the pregnancy began, monitoring her phone, isolating her from friends and family, showing signs of escalating domestic violence. The assembled spirits listened with the focused attention of a military briefing. Last week, Lisa tried to leave him, Maria continued. She packed a bag and went to her sister's house. Robert found her within hours, convinced her to come home, and I've been sensing the buildup toward a violent confrontation ever since. Classic pattern, observed Rebecca Thompson. Pregnancy increases the risk of domestic violence fatalities by 60%. The husband feels trapped, loses control, and she gestured to the gathering of spirits around them. So what do we do? Asked another spirit Marcus didn't recognize. Jennifer's expression was coldly calculating. We prevent another sister from joining our ranks, and we make sure Robert Chin faces consequences for what he's planning. What Marcus witnessed next was the most terrifying thing he'd encountered since this nightmare began. The dead organizing themselves with military precision to wage war on the living. Jennifer divided the spirits into 3 teams. The first group, led by Eleanor and the other long-dead spirits, would focus on Lisa Chun directly, appearing to her in dreams and visions, guiding her toward resources for abused women, trying to convince her to leave town entirely. The second team, composed of more recently deceased spirits who better understood modern technology and communication, would work to document Robert's abusive behavior. They could manipulate electronic devices, trigger security cameras at opportune moments, and ensure evidence of his crimes was preserved. The third team, led by Jennifer herself, would focus on Robert directly. What kind of focus? Marcus called out, unable to remain silent any longer. The assembled spirits turned toward him with expressions ranging from surprise to annoyed. He'd been so quiet during their gathering that most had forgotten he was there. Father Holloway, Jennifer acknowledged, still playing the role of conscience? Someone has to, Marcus replied, stepping closer to the supernatural council. I understand your anger. I sympathize with your desire for justice. But what you're planning sounds like premeditated murder. It is, Jennifer said simply. The same thing that was done to us. That doesn't make it right. Catherine Morrison laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Right? Father, I spent 47 years trying to do things right. I stayed with my abusive husband because my church said divorce was a sin. I didn't report his violence because the police said it was a family matter. I tried to leave him 3 times and went back because I had nowhere else to go. "And how did your righteousness end?" Maria Santos added, "With my boyfriend's hands around my throat because I wouldn't kill his child." Marcus felt the weight of their collective suffering pressing down on him like a physical force. These weren't monsters. They were victims who'd been failed by every system designed to protect them. But that didn't make vigilante justice acceptable. "There are other ways," he insisted. "Legal ways. Social services, restraining orders, safe houses. The same systems that failed us in life?" Rebecca Thompson's 19th century dress rustled as she stepped forward. "Father, in my time, a woman had no legal recourse against her husband's violence. In 1889, my father had the legal right to kill me for bringing shame to the family. The law was his accomplice." "And how much has really changed?" asked another spirit. "Lisa Chun called the police twice in the past month. Both times, they told her husband to cool down and left. The restraining order she filed was dismissed because Robert convinced the judge she was suffering from pregnancy-induced paranoia." Marcus felt his arguments crumbling under the weight of harsh reality. These spirits weren't motivated by mindless vengeance. They were responding to systemic failures that had persisted for centuries. "So what's your solution?" Marcus asked. "Kill every potentially abusive husband in America? Just the ones who are planning to kill their wives," Jennifer replied. "We're not indiscriminate killers, Father. We're surgical. We target specific threats that have demonstrated clear intent to harm." "How can you be certain of intent?" Eleanor spoke up for the first time during the gathering. "We can sense it. Death changes you, opens you to perceptions the living don't have. We can feel the moment when anger turns to murderous rage, when planning becomes commitment to action." "Robert Chun crossed that line yesterday," Maria added. "He's bought a gun. He's researched ways to make murder look like suicide. He's written a note explaining how his wife's pregnancy complications became too much for her to bear." The assembled spirits began to disperse, moving with purpose toward their assigned tasks. Marcus watched them fade into the pre-dawn darkness, leaving him alone with Jennifer and Eleanor. "This won't end with Robert Chun," Marcus said. "You know that, don't you? Once you start down this path, there's no going back?" Jennifer finished. "Father, we crossed that line the moment we were murdered. The moment the system failed to protect us. The moment our killers walked free while we were buried in the ground. But you're creating a cycle of violence." "We're breaking one," Eleanor corrected. "Every abuser we stop, every potential killer we prevent from acting, that's lives saved. Children who get to grow up with their mothers. Women who don't join our ranks." Marcus wanted to argue further, but the logic was undeniable. If these spirits could truly identify murderers before they acted, if they could prevent domestic violence fatalities, wasn't that a form of justice the living world had failed to provide? The moral complexity of the situation settled on him like a weight. These weren't evil entities seeking to harm innocent people. They were victims seeking to prevent other victims. But their methods, "What happens to me now?" Marcus asked. "I've seen too much. I know too much." Jennifer studied him with those blazing eyes. "That depends on you, Father. Are you with us? Or are you going to try to stop us?" Marcus realized he was standing at a crossroads that would define not just his career as a chaplain, but his understanding of justice, faith, and the nature of good and evil. "I need time to think," he said. "Time is a luxury Lisa Chun doesn't have," Jennifer replied. "Robert is planning to act within the week. By Sunday morning, she'll either be safe or she'll be one of us." The spirits faded away with the rising sun, leaving Marcus alone in the cemetery with a decision that would haunt him forever. He could report what he'd witnessed to his superiors, to the police, to anyone who would listen. But who would believe him? And even if they did, would that save Lisa Chin? Or he could stay silent, become complicit in whatever the spirits had planned, and hope that their vigilante justice would prevent another tragedy. As he walked back to his rectory, Marcus didn't notice the figure watching him from behind one of the older headstones. Someone else had witnessed the supernatural gathering. Someone who had their own plans for the vengeful spirits. Someone who understood that power, even supernatural power, could be controlled and directed by those clever enough to manipulate it. The game was about to change, and Marcus was about to learn that some living people were far more dangerous than any ghost. But that revelation was still 3 days away. 3 days during which the spirits would hunt Robert Chen. Marcus would struggle with his conscience, and Lisa Chun would fight for her life without knowing supernatural forces were battling over her fate. And when those 3 days ended, Marcus would discover that he'd been wrong about everything. The spirits weren't the most dangerous things in Evergreen Memorial Cemetery. The most dangerous thing was the person who'd been using them all along. Sunday morning came too soon, and with it, the sound of sirens wailing through the October air toward downtown Hartford. Marcus sat in his rectory, hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee, knowing with sick certainty what those sirens meant. The spirits had kept their promise. His phone buzzed with a news alert. Local man found dead in apparent home invasion. Wife hospitalized in critical condition. The photo showed Robert Chen's house cordoned off with police tape, and Marcus felt his stomach clench with a mixture of relief and revulsion. They'd done it. The Supernatural Council had prevented another murder. But at what cost? The knock on his door came at exactly noon, 3 sharp raps that seemed to echo through the rectory like gunshots. Marcus opened it to find a woman he'd never seen before, mid-40s, professionally dressed, with the kind of predatory smile that made his veteran instincts scream warnings. "Father Holloway?" she said, extending a manicured hand. "My name is Dr. Evelyn Cross. I believe we need to talk." Marcus didn't take the offered hand. Something about this woman set every alarm bell in his head ringing. About what? About your unusual parishioners. The ones who've been so busy playing vigilante across New England. Her smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too white, too sharp. "May I come in? I have a proposition that might interest you." Against his better judgment, Marcus stepped aside. Dr. Cross entered his home with the confident stride of someone accustomed to getting what they wanted. She moved directly to his window, gazing out at the cemetery with an expression of naked hunger. "Beautiful view," she said. "All those restless souls, all that untapped potential. Do you have any idea what you're sitting on here, Father?" "I think you should leave," Marcus said, his hand moving instinctively to where his service pistol used to hang during his military days. Dr. Cross turned, and Marcus saw that her eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils, but the entire visible surface. They reflected the morning light like oil slicks. "Oh, I don't think so," she said, and her voice carried harmonics that reminded him uncomfortably of Jennifer's supernatural tones. "You see, I've been watching your little spirit council for quite some time, studying them, learning their patterns." "What are you?" "I'm a researcher, Father, a collector of rare phenomena, and your cemetery has become quite the supernatural hotspot." She moved closer, and Marcus noticed that she cast no reflection in the mirror hanging on his wall. "Do you know what's truly remarkable about spirits bound by trauma? They're incredibly malleable." Marcus's blood ran cold. "You've been manipulating them, guiding them," Dr. Cross corrected. "Jennifer Walsh's transformation wasn't entirely natural, you see. It required a little encouragement. A whisper here, a suggestion there. She thinks her evolution from warning spirit to vengeful hunter was her own idea. But powerful emotions need direction, focus. Left to their own devices, traumatized spirits just wander and wail. But with the right influence, you created this. The council, the organized hunting, that was you. I provided inspiration. They provided the power." Her black eyes gleamed. "And together we've accomplished something beautiful. A network of supernatural assassins, perfectly motivated, utterly ruthless, and completely convinced they're serving justice." Marcus staggered backward, pieces of a horrifying puzzle falling into place. "The pregnancy pattern, the 20-year cycles. You've been doing this for centuries, Father, though never with such spectacular results. Usually, I have to work with just 1 or 2 spirits at a time. But Jennifer Walsh, she was special. Such rage, such charisma. Perfect leadership material. What do you want from me?" Dr. Cross smiled, And this time Marcus saw that her teeth weren't just white and sharp. They were moving, shifting like living things in her mouth. Your cooperation, your silence, and most importantly, your help in expanding operations. Expanding. This is just the beginning, Father. Every cemetery in America has its share of murdered women, its quota of spirits bound by trauma and injustice. With the right guidance, they could all be awakened, organized, directed. The magnitude of what she was proposing hit Marcus like a physical blow. A supernatural army of vengeful spirits, coordinated and controlled, hunting across the entire country. It would be vigilante justice on an unprecedented scale. "You're insane," he whispered. "I'm practical," she corrected. "The legal system fails women every day. Police dismiss domestic violence calls. Courts release abusers on bail. Victims die while waiting for protection that never comes. But dead women," her laugh was like breaking glass. "Dead women are much more effective at prevention. And what do you get out of it?" Dr. Cross moved to his bookshelf, running a finger along the spines of his theological texts. Where she touched them, the books withered and cracked. "Power, Father. Every spirit that joins my network makes me stronger. Every life they take feeds me. I'm not just collecting supernatural phenomena, I'm harvesting it." Marcus realized he was looking at something far older and more dangerous than any cemetery spirit. Whatever Dr. Cross was, she'd been playing this game for a very long time. "The spirits don't know what you are," he said. "Of course not. They see me as a sympathetic researcher, someone who understands their plight and wants to help them find justice. And in a way, that's true. I do want to help them. Their success is my success. But you're using them. We're using each other. They get their revenge, I get my power, and society gets cleaned up one dead abuser at a time. Everyone wins." Marcus thought about Jennifer and Eleanor, about the decades of pain and frustration that had driven them to accept this partnership. They had no idea they were being manipulated by something that made their human killers look like saints. "What if I refuse to help you?" Dr. Cross turned back to the window, where the cemetery lay peaceful in the afternoon sun. "Then you'll have an accident. A slip on some icy steps, perhaps, or maybe a heart attack brought on by stress. These things happen to men your age. And if I agree, then you become my liaison with the spirits. Help me guide their expansion efforts. Smooth over any complications that arise with local authorities." She faced him again, and her black eyes seemed to pull light from the room. "Plus, you get to live. Always a nice bonus." Marcus found himself at another crossroads, but this one felt different from his moral quandary 3 days ago. This wasn't about justice versus mercy or the complexity of vigilante action. This was about pure evil masquerading as justice and his role in enabling it. "I need time to consider," he said. "Time is something I have plenty of, Father. But patience." Her smile is predatory. "That's in shorter supply. You have until sunset. After that, I'll assume you've chosen the difficult path." Dr. Cross moved toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and Father, don't think about warning your spirit friends. They can't see me for what I really am, and they wouldn't believe you if you told them. In their eyes, I'm their greatest ally, their liberator." She left without another word, and Marcus was alone with the horrible knowledge that he'd become a pawn in a game far more complex and dangerous than he'd imagined. But Dr. Cross had made one crucial error. She'd assumed that Marcus would make his decision based on fear for his own life. She hadn't considered that a man who'd survived Vietnam and dedicated his life to serving others might be willing to sacrifice himself to stop something truly evil. Marcus had 6 hours until sunset. 6 hours to figure out how to break a supernatural network that had taken centuries to build. 6 hours to find a way to free the spirits from manipulation they didn't even know existed. He started by doing something Dr. Cross probably hadn't expected. He began to pray, not for divine intervention or miraculous salvation, but for wisdom, for guidance, for the strength to do what needed to be done, regardless of the personal cost. Because Marcus had realized something that Dr. Cross, for all her power and cunning, had overlooked. The spirits weren't just bound by trauma and injustice. They were also bound by their fundamental humanity, by the love and hope that had once defined them in life. And if Marcus could remind them of that, if he could show them what they were really serving, he might be able to turn Dr. Cross's own weapon against her. But first, he had to survive long enough to try. And as the afternoon shadows grew longer across Evergreen Memorial Cemetery, Marcus began to suspect that survival was going to be the least of his challenges. The real test would come when the spirits discovered the truth about their liberator, when they realized they'd been trading one form of bondage for another, when they learned that their quest for justice had made them servants of something that viewed human suffering as nothing more than a source of power. Some revelations, Marcus knew, could drive even the dead to madness. And what happened when an army of supernatural vigilantes realized they'd been betrayed? Well, that was something no one had ever witnessed before, but they were about to find out. The sun was setting behind the ancient oaks of Evergreen Memorial Cemetery when Marcus made his choice. He walked among the headstones, carrying his father's old service revolver loaded with bullets that had been blessed in 3 different faiths: Christian, Jewish, and Muslim. If he was going to face something as old and powerful as Dr. Cross, he figured he needed all the divine help he could get. The spirits materialized as darkness fell, gathering for what had become their nightly council meeting. Marcus counted 47, now 4 new members since their campaign against Robert Chin. Word was spreading through the supernatural community, just as Dr. Cross had planned. Jennifer stood at the center of the group, her wedding dress now completely stained with grave dirt and what might have been blood. She'd grown more solid over the past week, more present in the physical world. The others looked to her with something approaching worship. "Father," she acknowledged as Marcus approached. "Have you come to finally choose a side?" "I have," Marcus replied. "But first, there's something you all need to know about your benefactor." Eleanor tilted her translucent head. "Benefactor, Dr. Evelyn Cross, the researcher who's been helping you organize, guiding your expansion efforts, providing the spiritual energy that's made all this possible." The spirits exchanged glances. Marcus could see confusion rippling through their ranks. "There is no Dr. Cross," Jennifer said slowly. "Our power comes from our collective rage, our shared purpose." "Does it?" Marcus pulled out his phone and showed them a photograph he'd taken that afternoon. Dr. Cross standing in his rectory, her image clearly visible in the digital display. "Then explain this." The spirits stared at the photo with growing alarm. In the image, Dr. Cross appeared exactly as Marcus had seen her, professionally dressed, predatory smile, and most tellingly, those completely black eyes. "You can see her," whispered Maria Santos, "but we can't. She's been manipulating you from the beginning," Marcus explained, "feeding off your actions, growing stronger with every life you take. You think you're serving justice, but you're really just tools in her collection." The temperature around them dropped 20 degrees in an instant. Jennifer's eyes blazed brighter than Marcus had ever seen them. "Impossible," she hissed. "We would have sensed." "Would you?" Dr. Cross's voice cut through the night air like a blade. She materialized at the edge of the gathering, no longer bothering to hide her true nature. Her form was wreathed in shadow, her black eyes reflecting the spirit's own supernatural light. "You were so eager for someone to validate your anger, to give you purpose. You never questioned where your sudden power came from." The spirits recoiled as if struck. For the first time since her resurrection, Jennifer looked uncertain. "What are you?" Eleanor demanded. "I'm what humans become when they stop caring about right and wrong and focus solely on power," Dr. Cross replied. "I've been cultivating networks like yours for 8 centuries, Father Holloway, turning trauma into weapons, grief into tools. Your spirits are simply my most successful project to date." "You lied to us," Jennifer said, her voice carrying the fury of the truly betrayed. "I gave you purpose, direction. Without me, you'd still be wandering aimlessly, warning people who wouldn't listen, watching helplessly as the cycle continued." Dr. Cross moved closer to the circle of spirits. "I made you powerful. I made you effective. You made us murderers," Rebecca Thompson accused. You were already murderers. I just made you better at it." That's when Marcus saw something he'd never expected. The spirits turning their attention away from Dr. Cross and toward him. Not with hostility, but with something like hope. "What do we do, Father?" Eleanor asked. "How do we break free?" Marcus had spent the afternoon researching everything he could find about entities like Dr. Cross. The answer he'd found wasn't one any of them would like. "The connection between you is powered by your rage, your desire for revenge," he explained. "As long as you remain focused on punishment and violence, she can feed off you, control you. So we just forgive?" Jennifer's voice was bitter. "Accept what was done to us and move on?" "No," Marcus said carefully, "but maybe you could redirect your purpose. Instead of hunting killers, protect potential victims. Instead of taking lives, save them. Use your power to guide threatened women to safety, to expose abusers before they can act." Dr. Cross laughed, a sound like breaking bones. "Lovely sentiment, Father, but you're forgetting something crucial." She raised her hand, and Marcus felt an invisible force wrap around his throat. His feet left the ground as he was lifted into the air, his blessed bullets useless against something that existed partially outside the physical realm. "I don't need their willing cooperation anymore. I have enough power stored up from their previous actions to control them directly." Her black eyes blazed. "They can choose to serve me willingly, or I can simply overwrite their personalities. Turn them into perfect supernatural soldiers with no troublesome consciences." Marcus gasped for air, his vision starting to blur. But through the gathering darkness, he saw something that gave him hope. The spirits weren't attacking Dr. Cross. They weren't trying to save him. They were joining hands, all 47 of them, forming a circle around Dr. Cross with Marcus suspended at the center. Their individual supernatural energies began to merge, creating a combined force that made the air itself vibrate with power. "What are you doing?" Dr. Cross demanded, her grip on Marcus loosening slightly. "Something we should have done from the beginning," Jennifer replied. "Taking responsibility for our choices." The merged energy of the spirits began to shift, transforming from the dark, violent force that Dr. Cross had been feeding on into something else entirely, something bright and clean and purposeful. Marcus felt the change as warmth spreading through his body. This wasn't the cold fury of revenge. It was the fierce protectiveness of mothers and wives and daughters who refused to let anyone else suffer as they had suffered. Dr. Cross shrieked as her connection to the spirits was severed. The power she'd been siphoning from them suddenly cut off. She released Marcus, who fell to the ground gasping, and began to fade like smoke. "This isn't over," she snarled. "There are others, other networks, other cemeteries. You can't stop them all." "Maybe not," Eleanor said peacefully, "but we can try, and we can warn them about you." Dr. Cross's form dissipated entirely, leaving behind only the lingering scent of sulfur and decay. The spirits maintained their circle for a moment longer, their combined energy settling into something stable and protective. Then, one by one, they began to fade. "Where are you going?" Marcus asked, struggling to his feet. "To do what we should have been doing all along," Jennifer replied. Her wedding dress was clean now, white and pure as it had been on her wedding day. "To protect instead of punish, to guide instead of hunt. Will I see you again?" Jennifer smiled, and for the first time since her resurrection, it was an expression of peace rather than rage. "When you need us, Father, when someone needs protection, we'll be there. But quietly now, gently, the way it should have been from the beginning." The spirits faded away with the dawn, leaving Marcus alone in the cemetery with the knowledge that he'd witnessed something unprecedented, the redemption of the damned. In the days that followed, the pattern of mysterious deaths across New England stopped entirely. But missing person reports dropped by 60%, and women's shelters across the region reported an unprecedented number of abuse victims seeking help, often claiming they'd been guided to safety by dreams of women in white. Marcus remained at Evergreen Memorial Cemetery for another 3 years, serving as chaplain and guardian. He never saw the spirits again directly, but sometimes, on particularly dark nights, He'd catch glimpses of white figures moving among the headstones, not hunting or threatening, but simply watching, protecting. He kept detailed records of everything he'd witnessed, knowing that someday, someone else might need to know about entities like Dr. Cross and the networks they built. Because she'd been right about one thing: there were others out there, other creatures that fed on trauma and turned victims into weapons. But Marcus had learned something important too. Even the most damaged souls could choose redemption over revenge, protection over punishment. It just took someone willing to show them the way. The spirits of Evergreen Memorial Cemetery had found their peace at last, and in doing so, they'd ensured that others might find theirs as well. But the story doesn't end there, because 3 years later, Marcus received a letter from a chaplain in Oregon, describing encounters with spirits that sounded remarkably familiar. And attached to the letter was a photograph of a woman who looked exactly like Dr. Cross, standing in a cemetery 2,000 miles away. The network was rebuilding itself. The cycle was beginning again. And somewhere in the darkness between life and death, the spirits of Evergreen Memorial Cemetery stirred, knowing their work wasn't finished after all. And that, my friends, brings us to the end of our journey through the darkest corners of cemetery chaplain horror. 5 stories of faith tested, evil confronted, and the thin line between justice and vengeance explored in the most terrifying ways possible. But before you try to convince yourself these are just stories, just flights of imagination designed to give you goosebumps in the dark, remember this: every cemetery has its chaplain. Every chaplain has their stories. And some stories are true, whether we want to believe them or not. Speaking of true stories that challenge everything we think we know about reality, you need to check out my video about what happened in the aftermath of the Chernobyl disaster. The things people saw in those radioactive ruins will make tonight's ghost stories seem like bedtime lullabies. Click the link that should be appearing on your screen right now to discover the horrifying truth about what really walks through the dead zone of Chernobyl. Sweet dreams, and remember to lock your doors.